Hey, well, good morning, everyone. I am Annette Oltmans. I'm the founder and the CEO of the MEND Project. Thank you for joining us for this month's training intensive, Silence, when bystanders silence victims or when they remain silent. Today is the launch of our 2022 training intensive series. On the third Tuesday of each month, we take a deeper look at a single subject and offer an hour training on Zoom and Facebook Live. You may find recordings of our prior intensives on our Facebook page or our YouTube channel. And we have so many intensives in the bank already that go into really meaningful topics. So I hope that you'll take a look at that. To stay informed, please subscribe on our website or follow us on social media. And if there are topics that you'd like to see us cover, please feel free to share them with themendproject.com. We'd love to hear from you. The MEND Project is a nonprofit organization that I founded in 2016 to educate, equip, and restore all those impacted by abuse. We teach survivors, victims, we teach responders, many therapists, faith-based leaders, and other nonprofits regarding abuse, those nonprofits that are on the front line serving marginalized communities. We train them on abuse, mostly covert emotional abuse, and then double abuse, what happens when victims reach out for help. We train them how to understand the complexities of abuse and how to respond to victims correctly in order to prevent double abuse. Double abuse specifically is the secondary harm that often occurs when a victim reaches out for help, but is inadvertently and even sometimes intentionally harmed by those whom the victim places their trust. Victims are often not believed, or they are judged, or they're criticized. They may be given incorrect instructions, interrogated, and pointed in leading, condescending ways, and even blamed for the abuse. These are forms of double abuse. So before we get into today's topic, I want to share an exciting opportunity if you are a survivor or a victim of abuse. This March, we will be holding a space for victims and survivors of abuse in a public training cohort, during which we will go through our Responding to Abuse training curriculum. This 7-week interactive online course will teach you all about emotional abuse, trauma, double abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, and many other related topics that will help you gain further clarity and hopefully set you on a path of healing. Please visit our website and sign up to receive more information about training and curriculum. This will ensure that you'll get notice when registration opens. Today, we're going to talk about the topic of silence. Silence can be a positive and powerful tool when working with someone who has been traumatized. It can be used to slow down thoughts, breathing exercises, and meditation. It can be very calming, peaceful, and healing. In fact, in our healing model of compassion, where we teach responders how to interface with victims, we advise them to remain silent and to put on a really good listening ear, because that is what a victim needs most when they share with you, to listen, listen, listen. And to not interrupt, to not advise, but to be there for them in a compassionate way. Victims of abuse will suffer in silence because nobody listens to them with the correct type of compassion. And we teach what correct compassion looks like in our healing model of compassion, which you can find on our website. So when a responder of abuse offers quiet listening with compassion, it's a healing balm for the victim and creates a safe space for the victim breaking their silence to process what they've been going through out loud with a safe person. And this is an important process in any victim's journey. There are times, however, when the action of silence can be harmful. And in honor of Martin Luther King Day, I wanted to share a powerful quote of his on the harm of silence. He said, "The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that of the good people." Dr. King had the ability to understand and to have compassion for marginalized communities. He calls for us all to end our silence for the benefit of those who are in the margins of the margins. His call to not remain silent is a powerful one and has applications in this world of abuse specifically, because abuse victims face considerable discrimination. One of the reasons a responder or bystander would remain silent is they carry unconscious bias around the topic of abuse. A few examples of that are some think victims might be exaggerating, or they ask themselves, why didn't he or she just leave? Or why are they just now coming out and telling me this if this has been going on so long? Some believe domestic violence only touches the uneducated and certain microcultures. And so they think that they are asking for it in a way and are not taking active steps to prevent or stop the abuse. Others think victims provoke their abusers, and so on. When I was in Thailand years ago, this is just an example of one way that authorities silence victims. I saw a white gentleman in his 50s holding the hand of a little Thai boy. He couldn't have been more than 4 years old. And he walked into a sex shop with him. And I saw a police officer right outside who did nothing. Now, sex trafficking is illegal in Thailand, but without enforcement, with that police officer just remaining silent and doing nothing, it's an example of how these cultural biases, these accepted norms in certain societies, doubly abuse victims and perpetuate and allow abuse to continue. We also appreciate another strong call of Martin Luther King in a similar quote of his that states, "There comes a time when silence is betrayal." Silence when we see someone being put down and we don't speak out, we instead choose to laugh at the expense of the one who is the brunt of the joke, is just one small way that we may all have participated in silencing a victim and doubly abusing them. At the moment a victim chooses to disclose their abuse, it's determined whether they will go on a journey of healing or remain on a path of further harm and oppression. How a person responds often impacts the victim's path. When abuse is disclosed from a victim to a responder that they know and trust, such as a friend, a family member, a therapist, or pastor, the victim's expectation is that it will be safe for them, free of judgment or condemnation, and they will be well cared for. Being quiet and listening attentively with compassion is an important ingredient for creating that safe place. But in some circumstances, silence can have the opposite effect. Let's take a look at what might be happening for the person responding to the victim. Becoming aware of abuse makes many people uncomfortable, even stressed. They might fear not knowing what to do or say, or they find themselves fearful of knowing abuse is happening. They might be concerned that too much will be expected of them, or they're uncomfortable with the negative distress the victim is demonstrating. Perhaps they feel overwhelmed and detached. Some responders can even be apathetic by ignoring the victim's need for intervention, or they may feel they are unable to effectively engage at any level, perhaps not even in an intentional or nefarious way. Or the responder may have a good relationship with the alleged abuser and thereby not believe the victim's story because they have seen the abuser in a different light than what the victim sees behind closed doors. Or the responder wants to take a neutral stand and not choose sides. It's important to note that there is no neutrality in abuse. Neutrality benefits only one person, the abuser. And any of these points of view may cause responders of abuse to simply go silent. Their silence won't be received as compassion, but rather it will be interpreted by the victim as disdain, judgment, or condemnation, further harming the victim. We call this double abuse. So whatever the reason, remember that this type of silence can cause significant harm to victims, often pushing them into deeper isolation And it's important to note exacerbated trauma, because double abuse exacerbates a victim's trauma. It leads them to a sense of hopelessness and despair. And it can actually escalate post-traumatic stress disorder into complex post-traumatic stress disorder. While silence can be very painful and push a victim into further isolation, silence can also impact the abuser in a way that is to the detriment of the victim and to the detriment of the abuser. Occasionally, both the victim and the abuser will be in front of a responder, such as a therapist, a minister, or even family or friends. And when these responders react to a disclosure of abuse with silence, often they don't realize their silence is actually empowering the abuser. It also increases the victim's distress, who may lose hope that they will ever find someone who will help them end the abuse. When you embolden an abuser, you set the abuser on a path that does not lead to healing. So it actually harms the abuser as well. In another scenario, when the abuser is in front of the responder with or without the victim, and the responder, through their words, does not confront that person for their harmful behaviors, the silence emboldens the abuser in that way. They learn through the other person's silence that either their behavior patterns are socially acceptable or that no one will intervene. This happens often when a responder is one-on-one with an abuser and is trying to develop trust in the relationship. And rather than keep the abuser accountable, they keep silence when they hear about the destructive behavior patterns. Sadly, this also happens in couples therapy a lot, which I have shared about in a previous intensive in greater depth. And I hope that you will take a look at that intensive on couples therapy. We see this dynamic play out often because therapists are trained to treat each person equally, and often they will align with the abuser to gain their trust, thinking it will help in the long run, but it actually causes added trauma and a sense of betrayal and greater harm to the victim. Sometimes they are not adequately trained in the subtle signs of covert emotional abuse to be able to identify the problem. So they don't see it even when it's playing out in the therapeutic setting, false accusations by the abuser to derail the conversation, against the victim, or blame shifting, lying, things of that nature. They just are, the therapist becomes confused. They don't recognize these patterns, and they don't know the behavior specifically that constitute emotional abuse. So in that case, then the victim actually experiences it as collusion with the abuser, which is highly traumatic when what the victim truly needs is absolute alignment with the therapist. Therapists also often think that if they don't align with the abuser will leave therapy. Well, it's important that the abuser does leave therapy because to be confronted by the therapist, because it's critical that the therapist aligns with the victim. The victim is the one who's experiencing the harm. And that harm is post-traumatic stress and so many other symptoms that must take priority over the well-being of the abuser. Remember, abuse disclosure takes a great deal of strength and courage. Sure, it's hard to hear, and it can be very difficult in certain circumstances, but it's so much harder for the victim to speak out. A person within an actively abusive relationship over time loses the strength of their sense of identity and struggles significantly with self-doubt. Most often their abuser has been demeaning them consistently over time, and it gaslights the victim, and they develop a lot of self-doubt and confusion. And the victim has been blamed with various false justifications by the abuser. This makes the idea of exposing the secret life of abuse they have been living exceedingly difficult for the victim. They're genuinely confused and don't have clarity about their situation. Even if there's been physical violence, the emotional abuse is so much more predominant. and it causes this stress and confusion, which compromises the victim's thinking and cognition and thinking patterns. They become fragmented and, like I said, confused. This vulnerable state, coupled with the stigma of abuse, makes it nearly impossible to believe that they will be well received when they disclose their abuse to another person. When discomfort turns to silence time and time again, that contributes to the victim not sharing, to their own detriment, because they are so fearful of reaching out. They have this anticipatory fear. We hear about flashbacks, but this is actually a flash forward where they anticipate new trauma. They instinctively know that if they are not well received with compassion, that it will be more than they can bear and that it will lead to hopelessness. And so there is this strong fear that a victim must overcome in order to feel comfortable to share their story. They experience shame, guilt, apprehensive, and avoidance. A victim instinctively knows they have everything to lose by disclosing their story of abuse if the responder chooses to not believe them or treats them with apathy or disdain. It takes everything inside of them to disclose their experience. I would like to help reshape your view of a victim's disclosure of abuse. When a responder is aware of abuse or abuse has been disclosed, it is actually empowering for the responder. It allows the responder to identify abuse, to help the victim name the behaviors. And we have a whole list of these behaviors on our website under covert emotional abuse. And when we can be a responder that is empowered in this way, we can actually help a victim gain clarity. It allows the responder to identify abuse, name abuse, be a resource, and guide the victim to get the help they desperately need and deserve. It empowers a responder to protect others and prevent damage in the lives of all those who are impacted, particularly if children are involved. A responder actually has a responsibility, but that responsibility is a gift. It is a gift when a victim comes to you and shows you that kind of trust. It's empowering and a privilege to help another person towards their safety and well-being. Until a responder or bystander is able to put away their fear or faulty assumptions, biases, abuse will continue to remain because silence perpetuates violence because it remains hidden in darkness. A responder can be a vessel of bringing abuse into the light for the victim to effectuate change. We can see the silencing of victims in multiple areas, and I'd like to talk about a few of those today. First is silencing of victims by institutions. Think of Dr. Larry Nassar and how he abused so many girls, and then how USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University shut down victims, did not believe them, and did not intervene. Time and again, the victim becomes the accused within their surrounding circles. Almost, it's so common that this happens in institutions that it's, what am I trying to say? It leads a victim to such a sense of hopelessness and despair because they believe that institutions, particularly those who are knowledgeable and professional, have the knowledge and the resources to be able to intervene. And when they don't, it exacerbates their trauma. Although most victims will not have to share their story on public platforms, the message to victims in general has become clear that many do not want to believe that abuse happens or that the perpetrator is capable of abuse. We also see silencing of victims in the church. Sadly, it's all too common. A few more prominent examples we saw in the news recently were the former senior pastor of Willow Creek Church, Bill Hybels, and Christian minister and apologist, Ravi Zacharias. Very frequently, the individual who discloses the truth will be silenced by the institutional church, as is what happened with these two Christian leaders. They retaliated against the victim who came forward and slandered the victim and significantly ostracizing them from their church community and exacerbating their trauma. We have seen in a few of these examples a common way that institutions, faith-based or otherwise, silence victims and protect the abuser are through non-disclosure agreements. Often after intense pressure, slander, and other forms of retaliation, including threats to like lawsuits. And if the victim files a lawsuit, they will do a countersuit, anything to shut the victim down. And they feel forced into signing a non-disclosure agreement, sometimes in exchange for monetary reparations, which in most cases they desperately need therapy and other medical resources. In some cases, receiving a settlement and signing a non-disclosure agreement can be the best result for the victim, helping them to avoid the trauma and expense of a lawsuit or other forum to resolve their complaint. But other times, buying the victim's silence is for the sole purpose of protecting the institution and the abuser at the expense of the victim and potential future victims. In most cases, and it's a legalistic approach that places the image of the institution above the well-being of the victims who have been affected. In most cases, victims are simply seeking an apology and assurances that the abuser will be held accountable and no further victims will be harmed. But so often institutions immediately take a legalistic stance and shut the victim down with lawyers and other, like I said, retaliation, blame, and things to mischaracterize the victim. Finally, I want to make a note of how victims of abuse can also be silenced by law enforcement. While many within law enforcement are well-intentioned and endeavor to ensure justice and safety prevail, too often police dismiss survivors who go to law enforcement. As I stated earlier, there remains an unconscious bias against victims and females in particular that compels this responder to belittle the victim's disclosure and minimize or even dismiss the abuse. Often in this scenario, they miss the signs of trauma that the victim is displaying. And they mistake it for the victim being over emotional, or perhaps they misinterpret the signs of trauma, the symptoms of trauma, as a sign of emotional instability. And the testimony by the victim should not be taken too seriously. This attitude results in government's decisions to remain silent, to not take action against the abuser. When people in positions of authority and perceived expertise silence victims in various ways, the victim's trauma is significantly exacerbated. When people in positions of authority, put it this way, when victims communicate and disclose their abuse to people in perceived authority or actual authority, and those persons do not respond according to best practices, the victim has an actual expectation that these authorities are knowledgeable and will respond correctly. And so the disparity between their expectation and what actually occurs equates exactly into the level of trauma they will experience from the encounter. For example, we see in some cities like Detroit, Albuquerque, and Washington, D.C., systemic failures to test rape kits based on budgetary restrictions or officers' assumption that there was no sexual assault. And this exacerbates the trauma. The victim is forced into silence because they don't have the advocacy of authorities to follow through on their complaints. They are left without any remedy. In other circumstances, we see officers making damaging statements in their police report that reflect negatively against the victim and harm their ability to get restraining orders or other protections through the court system. One example of this would be if the perpetrator is breaking a restraining order and comes to the house and the victim doesn't know what the perpetrator is going to do, so they're highly traumatized based on their past experience with the perpetrator. The perpetrator may be, if the victim calls the police, the perpetrator may be displaying him or herself as being calm, but the victim is having a traumatic reaction, a very fearful reaction. And so the police will often write that the victim blew it out of proportion or appeared unstable and unreasonable, which then reflects very poorly on them when they try to extend the restraining order. And so the words that police write and their perception of trauma and abuse is really critical to be accurate and to follow best practices, but so often this doesn't happen. It also explains why 1 in 3 survivors feel less safe after contacting police, and why so many victims then remain silent for future experiences of abuse. When police authorities ignore victims and fail to prosecute or issue restraining orders, victims know that their abuser will become emboldened and feel invincible, bringing even more abuse their way. Another thing that can happen is when a victim reacts to their abuser violently after years of being in the relationship. They are then treated by law enforcement as another abuser, when in fact they are acting in self-defense against the real abuser, or they are having a traumatic response that creates what we call reactive abuse. But reactive abuse is most often an involuntary traumatic response based on past experiences with the abuser and their flash forward about what may be about to occur. And that response, that involuntary response, that trauma response, should not be viewed the same as the original abuse. But so often law enforcement will say there's always 2 abusers and 2 victims because they see the signs of trauma, but they misinterpret them. These 2 forms of abuse are employed out of very different motives, reactive abuse versus original abuse. If you are someone who is walking alongside a victim, I have a lot of respect for you for taking the time to dig deeper into the complex topic of abuse. It's important to remember as a responder that there are many resources available to you to assist you or to refer the victim out. If you are ill-equipped, don't abandon the victim. Refer them, take the time to hand carry them to someone who is qualified or to a domestic violence organization who can help them. Okay. Being educated and equipped to respond will prevent the silence that may be tempting when you feel overwhelmed or apathetic. I cannot emphasize enough how valuable the Men Project's training would be for you. If you are not already on our mailing list to receive updates about training, please go onto our website to sign up today so you will be made aware of our next training cohort for responders. There are many resources for victims you might want to familiarize yourself with. One great resource is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. I also encourage you to become closely acquainted with your local domestic violence agency and shelter and to learn the services that they provide. To create a relationship with them really helps in your ability to advocate for the victim. And when the victim seeks the support of a domestic violence agency, they gain a whole group of advocates to help them navigate the process. And they can be very influential with law enforcement and other processes through the court system. Familiarize yourselves with the resources they offer. There are classes and programs to help victims gain clarity and empowerment offered by most domestic violence agencies. Some call it personal empowerment program, where they really take them through a stringent 10-week course where they learn the signs of abuse, emotional abuse, the confusing aspects of emotional abuse, and learn a new way to view themselves, not with self-doubt and disdain, but with confidence and assuredness, and to strengthen their self-identity. There are often counselors, advocates, and even legal help in these organizations. Another great resource is our website, where you will find, I mentioned earlier, the terms and definitions that describe covert abusive behaviors. These terms and definitions can help a victim gain clarity of their situation. And clarity is the exact remedy for confusion. Confusion causes a lot of stress. So when we can provide clarity by naming specific abusive behaviors, it validates a victim's experience. It breeds confidence into them that they are not crazy, that they are not the ones who are at fault, because so often they believe that it's something they're doing that's inciting the abuse. Or they think, I'm not lovable. Something must be inherently wrong with me, that I'm not able to communicate effectively in relationships. And that's why I never receive empathy and I'm always being put down because I'm doing something wrong. They really have this kind of self-doubt about themselves. By the way, you can download this list for free on our website. Tell the victim that they are not crazy and that it's not their fault. Tell them that nothing that they did is deserving of the abuse that they experienced. Abuse is a choice. It is not a mistake or an accident. It is a choice made by the abuser. There are so many other choices the abuser could make, but when they choose abuse, it is never the victim's fault. And that's an important affirmation to speak into them. These relationships are very difficult to understand. No two abuse situations are the same. And so right when you think you have it figured out, there's another complicated case where it's so different, you're starting over again. And so our website is full of resources to simplify the complicated nature of emotional abuse. Like I said, particularly covert emotional abuse, because covert emotional abuse is the common thread in all abuse cases. There is no relational abuse situation that does not include covert emotional abuse, whether it's child molestation, domestic violence, workplace sabotage, or sexual harassment. There's covert emotional abuse. The only time it's not present is in a one-time physical or sexual assault where there's not a relationship between the two parties. Okay, so now as we close, we'd like to take time for any questions you may have. Please feel free to drop them into the chat at this time or raise your hand and ask live.
Okay, Annette, we have one comment and two questions. So I'm going to go ahead and read the comment first. It says, "This is continuing to happen to me through my former church. I have no idea how to change that. My spouse is still welcome there. I have left that church. I don't know how to put that into a question today. I'm just noticing frustration on my part as I listen to what Annette is sharing."
I'm so sorry. It is so very hard. And sadly, it is all too common. We train churches. So I think it's a great idea that you left your church and to make a new community, because I find that what I hear from most victims is that when they leave the church, they're really well received at a new church when they tell their story, where the prior church doubts them because of their relationship with the abuser. If you wanted to really advocate for yourself, you could reach out to us and we could give you a sampling letter that you could send to your senior pastor that we have sent to other churches. And you could encourage them to become trained in emotional abuse, and we provide that training. But I'm really sorry. It's so hard. It's very traumatizing to be mischaracterized, to have your abuser be validated, and particularly in a church setting. It's spiritual abuse, and it hits you at your core.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah, there's two other questions. So the first one is, it seems when a responder confronts the abuser, they're ready and able to confront them. You mentioned that by demonstrating confrontation or boundary setting, it helps the victim do the same. But when does the victim know that they're ready and able to handle confronting the abuser? I would think it might take time before they're able. So how would they know when they're ready?
It's not something like one day you're not ready and the next day you're ready. It's kind of a process of testing the waters. Some abusers are not safe to set boundaries with because they're going to become very violent. And in that case, it's more important that you just create an exit plan. And that will in itself be your final boundary. And I want to mention, but I do encourage boundary setting because and boundary setting is really following through on your ultimatums. It's saying what you will and will not accept, and saying what the consequence will be, that the relationship will be broken, they will have to leave, and then following through on that. And that's not something that victims are, if they haven't been setting boundaries, or what I like to say too is that abusers are boundary crashers. You might have attempted to set boundaries many times and they just blow over those boundaries. It's something that as you gain clarity and as you have people in your community who support you and are speaking goodness into you and compassion and strength. And there's so many resources I feel like I need to mention. There's taking the personal empowerment program at domestic violence agencies. There is a podcast, two podcasts, but one is called Narcissist Apocalypse, and they offer inexpensive groups during the week in the evenings for people to join these groups and to become empowered with therapeutic help. There's a therapist there. There's also Flying Free with Natalie Hoffman. And twice a year, you can enroll in a coaching class with other abuse victims who are gaining their voice and learning to set boundaries. And then she has another class for after you have left the relationship and how to get your life back. But there are resources that you need to take advantage of that are not very expensive, and they're less expensive than counseling, and they can be very helpful.
Really good. Thank you, Annette. And I'm really thankful you addressed also setting boundaries and the danger that might be involved in that, because I know agencies are really, advocating to create a safety plan. So really important. Thank you for saying that. And then the final question we have is, it seems defeating to even go to law enforcement unless you literally fear for your life. What can we do to overcome this?
I wish that I could say that law enforcement was trained. There are domestic violence units at some law enforcement agencies, but really the best thing that I think you can do is to take advantage of a domestic violence agency's advocacy, because they have relationships and then you won't be standing alone. You'll have someone validating your experience. They will show you how to keep a journal documenting experiences and other ways that you can create credibility within yourselves. And it offers you, it shouldn't be this way, but when you have an advocate with you, it gives you extra credibility. And so that is the best thing that I can think of based on the fact that law enforcement does have biases, and they don't all, some are really well trained and they do a great job, but many do not. And so if it was me, I would definitely tap into an attorney and also into a domestic violence agency for advocacy.
Absolutely. And that's it for our questions today, Annette.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being with us, and particularly people who have returned. It's so good to see you. And I hope to see you at our next intensive. If you have any questions following this event, feel free to reach out to us at info@themenproject.com, and we respond to all of our emails. So please reach out. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. Bye.